Welcome back to Squawk Box. President Trump set to unveil some details on his tax plan today. Talk of slashing the corporate tax rate from 35 to 15% has some on Capitol Hill, including some Republicans, concerned about the deficit. Joining us right now from Washington, Congressman Peter Roskam. He's the chairman of the Ways and Means Tax Policy Committee. He's also a member of the Ways and Means Health Subcommittee. Good morning to you.
Hey, good morning. Great to be with you.
Thanks. Congressman, help us understand whether you'd be prepared to support a 15% corporate tax rate and whether it has to be paid for.
Look, I think a 15% corporate tax rate is terrific. I think we got to make sure that we deal with pass-throughs and individuals at the same time. The question about whether it's paid for or not is really ultimately a question about whether we want permanent tax policy or not. We can have a short-term tax policy, but it's pretty limited. And if what we're trying to do is influence behavior, that is, bring back manufacturing lines from overseas, have an American renaissance essentially, then the best thing to do is to create a tax policy that's permanent. And permanent means paid for. So that's the new fault line that we'll be developing. But I think it's good news that we're seeing presidential leadership on this issue. But we ought to make sure that we're really having a thorough debate on this and that we're not taking something that's just the easy way necessarily and giving up something that's ultimately better.
But where do you stand on that fault line, which is the pay for issue? Meaning, in your mind, do you want it to be paid for?
I want it to be paid for. I'm from the state of Illinois, and the state of Illinois is an example of how not to approach deficits. So we're now $20 trillion in debt in this country. My party, over the past several years, has raised this to a point of describing our debt question as a national security threat, and now all of a sudden we're just going to walk away from that. I don't think that's the smartest thing to do. I think the better thing is to say, let's pay for this. We can do it. We've got a blueprint in the House that proposes to do that. And toward that end, let's get to permanent tax policy, not a tax policy that turns the entire tax code into a big tax extender.
That blueprint still has that border adjustment tax in it. Are you holding on to that as well?
Yeah, I am. I think that there's a lot to be discussed about the border proposal. That gets to this whole notion of dealing with, ultimately, the base erosion problem. You put in the border proposal, and it doesn't matter where somebody places their manufacturing, because it's all going to be taxed based on the cash flow destination, as you know.
True, but if you get the rate low enough, that also deals with base erosion, right? Because then we become the most attractive place to invest.
Yes, but then you get back to this notion of, do you want temporary tax policy or do you want permanent tax policy? We can take temporary tax policy. That's apparently something that's being roundly discussed right now. But then in 10 years, we're going to be having this same discussion, rather than recognizing that we're at a national inflection point right now. It has been 30 years, obviously, since this tax code has been dealt with. Let's use the momentum. Let's use the consensus, the fact that nobody is defending the status quo. Let's take advantage of that, and let's drive towards a permanent change. But I think a permanent change is really worth fundamentally engaging on, rather than saying, you know what, it's too big, it's too hard, let's just cut the taxes and not worry about it. I think that leaves a lot of growth actually on the table.
Congressman, real quick on the pass-through issue. It's something that's evolved even over the past 48 hours. Your understanding of it and the implications for the wealthiest Americans. There clearly is a view that the wealthiest Americans, whether you're a hedge fund, a lawyer, or you have your own LLC, that your tax rate might ultimately be lower than many others.
Well, I don't know. I haven't seen the details of the White House proposal. What the blueprint is talking about, that is the House Republican proposal, says let's lower pass-throughs for the first time down to 25% for their business income. We propose to lower the individual rate to 33, as you know, and then get the corporate rate to 20. But that's all to say, these are proposed changes, and ultimately it's to create growth, simplicity, deal with base erosion, and to make this policy permanent. That's the name of the game.
Sir, you were unhappy with doing business with Iran. You introduced some legislation back in January which would require an examination every 6 months to see whether or not Iran Air was exclusively transporting passengers or also using those planes for other things which would be a violation of some sanctions. Do you think that legislation is going to go anywhere?
I think with the change in the administration, the disposition of the reporting that we've seen on Iran and what a bad deal it was that the Obama administration was giving things away that were not part of the public discussion. Now the question is, how come an iconic American company is choosing to do business with, without question, the world's largest state sponsor of terror, and giving them a product that is aircraft that can be used and is completely fungible from a civilian purpose to a military purpose? We know that they were using, that the Iranians were using civilian aircraft, purposing them on a military basis and getting material into Syria in the past several months. So I think this is a terrible idea. I think Boeing should walk away from this idea, and I think the administration should do everything it can to stop it.
Aren't they in your state?
They are in my state, and they ought not be doing this in my state. And they ought not be putting their own employees in the moral quandary that says, here, you want to work for us? You're going to be complicit in supporting the world's largest state sponsor of terror. It's a terrible idea. They ought not do it, regardless of where they're headquartered or where they're doing business.
And Congressman, real quickly on a separate note, another company in your state is United. Given that we've been running that video for the past couple of weeks now about that passenger being dragged off the plane, do you plan or do you think there should be any rules enacted legislatively on your end, or the FAA needs to put new rules into effect that relate to this?
I haven't seen a new rule necessarily that has to happen. I think the marketplace has been a very severe disciplinarian against United. United is probably getting in front of this, and they're going to make sure that that never happens again. I'm open to discussing if there has to be a rule, but my first instinct is not to create a new rule.
Congressman, we appreciate your time this morning. Thanks for joining us. You bet.
Coming up, Dow component Boeing reporting